It is 9:43 on a Wednesday night in November. The rain is falling in that quiet, relentless way it does in Nashville in the late fall, not dramatic, not storming, just steady and cold and indifferent to everything beneath it. A parking garage ramp on Fifth Avenue is slick and dark, lit by a single overhead light that flickers every few seconds like it cannot decide whether to stay on. And at the bottom of that ramp, lying on the wet concrete, is a man who owns 4 companies, 2 private aircraft, a penthouse apartment overlooking the Cumberland River, and at this precise moment, cannot get up off the ground. His name is Thomas Whitfield. He is 52 years old. He is worth $3.7 billion. And he has been lying on that ramp for 4 minutes, in the rain, in the dark, and not one single person has stopped. Not one. Cars have driven past the entrance. A man in a suit glanced up the ramp, looked directly at him, and kept walking. Thomas tried to call out. His voice echoed off the concrete and went nowhere. His phone skidded away when he fell and is now sitting face down near the drainage grate with a cracked screen, blinking weakly at 4% battery. His left ankle is sending pain up his leg with every small movement. And his chest, where he hit the ground hard on impact, is aching in a way that made him wonder, for a few terrible seconds after he fell, whether something worse was happening. He is alone. He is helpless. And the only person who is going to help him tonight is an 8-year-old girl in a pink jacket with a torn sleeve and 1 white sneaker and 1 gray one, who has no permanent home, no stable address, and no idea at all, that the man lying on that ramp is her father. Before we go any further into this story, and we need you to stay, because what happens in the next 48 hours is the kind of thing that makes you question everything you thought you understood about fate, about guilt, about what grief makes ordinary people capable of. We want to hear from you right now. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. We genuinely want to know where in the world this story is finding you tonight. And if you are new to this channel and you have not yet subscribed, do it right now, before this story goes any further, because the next video we have coming is just as real and just as impossible to look away from. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a single one. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened on that ramp, we have to go back 9 years. And the story does not start in Nashville. It starts in a hospital room in Charlotte, North Carolina, on the worst night of Thomas Whitfield's life, a night he has spent nearly a decade doing everything in his power not to think about, and failing every single time. Thomas Whitfield was not born into money. This matters, and it matters in a specific way that will become clear as this story unfolds. He grew up in Decatur, Georgia, in a 3-bedroom house with aluminum siding and a chain-link fence, the second of 3 sons born to a man who drove a delivery truck and a woman who did bookkeeping part-time from the kitchen table. They were not poor, exactly, but they lived in that particular American zone where everything is fine as long as nothing goes wrong, where one unexpected bill, one missed week of work, one car breaking down at the wrong moment can tip the entire structure. Thomas absorbed this precariousness early. He understood, even as a child, that the distance between stability and chaos was shorter than most people liked to believe. And he responded to that understanding by deciding, with the particular intensity of a person who has seen the edge up close, that he was never going to be near it again. He studied engineering at Georgia Tech on a partial scholarship, working 20 hours a week at a hardware store to cover the rest. He graduated in 4 years with a 3.8 GPA and went directly into a logistics consulting firm in Atlanta. He was sharp, fast, and completely relentless. He did not take vacations. He did not particularly understand people who did. He worked until 11 o'clock most nights, not because anyone required it of him, but because stopping felt like falling behind, and falling behind felt like falling back toward that kitchen table, back toward the aluminum siding, back toward the version of the world where one bad week could break everything. By 30 he was a senior manager. By 34 he had identified a systemic inefficiency in freight routing software that he believed he could solve better than anyone currently on the market. By 35 he had mortgaged everything he owned, taken out a business loan, and started a company he called Clearline Systems out of a rented office space in Midtown Atlanta that held 4 people and smelled like carpet adhesive. By 40 he had sold Clearline Systems for $112 million. He was not finished. He took that money and he built again, broader this time, into private equity and real estate and technology infrastructure. He was methodical and precise and entirely without sentiment when it came to his professional decisions. And he was, by the time he was in his early 40s, one of the most financially successful men in the southeastern United States and one of the loneliest. He had had relationships. Serious ones, even, over the years. But there was something in Thomas that resisted the final step of genuine vulnerability, that kept the most interior rooms of himself locked against sustained inspection. Women who cared about him had told him this, in various ways and with varying degrees of frustration, over the years. He had heard them. He had not fully changed. It was not performance, not cruelty, not indifference. It was something more structural than that, something built into the architecture of a man who had learned very young that the safest position was one of control, and that love, real love, required a kind of surrender he had no practiced relationship with. He understood this about himself. Understanding it did not make it easy to dismantle. And then, at 43 years old, at a charity fundraiser in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Thursday evening in April, he sat down next to a woman named Claire Addison because it was the only empty chair at the table, and within 40 minutes of conversation he was, for the first time in his adult life, completely disoriented. Not in an unpleasant way. In the way of someone who has been walking a very familiar road and suddenly realizes the landscape is entirely different from what they expected. Claire was a pediatric nurse practitioner. She was 38. She had warm, direct brown eyes and a quality of attention that was rare and immediately noticeable. When she looked at you, you felt actually seen, not evaluated, not categorized, but seen. She asked him what he did. He told her. She said, completely without irony or performance, "And do you actually like it?" 3 seconds passed. He said he did. She said, "Good. I think people should only spend their lives on things they genuinely like." Then she reached for the bread basket. He found himself wanting very badly to say something that would make her keep talking to him. They dated for 10 months. It was the most honest 10 months of Thomas Whitfield's adult life. Claire did not want anything from him except his actual self, not the version that ran boardrooms and issued quarterly reports, not the version that had learned to present competence as a substitute for intimacy. She wanted the version underneath that, the one that had grown up in Decatur with the chain-link fence, the one that was still, underneath everything, a little afraid of the edge. She found that version funny and worth knowing. She was patient with it in a way that did not feel like patience, it felt like certainty. Like she had looked at the whole of him, including the locked rooms, and decided it was worth staying. He proposed on a Tuesday night in her apartment, without a ring, because he had not gotten around to buying one and suddenly found he could not wait another day. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She laughed when she said it, the way someone laughs when they have already known the answer for months and are just waiting for the other person to catch up. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony at a botanical garden in Charlotte. They moved into a house on a quiet street with a yard that Claire immediately began filling with plants she named and spoke to like small unreliable colleagues. 14 months into their marriage, on a Sunday morning in late July, Claire slid a positive pregnancy test across the kitchen table and watched his face. Thomas Whitfield, who had negotiated 9-figure deals without visible emotion, who had sat in the rooms where enormous things were decided and kept his face perfectly still, put his face in his hands and shook with something that had no professional category, pure, overwhelming, ungovernable joy. They spent the next months in a state of careful, luminous preparation. They painted a room the color of morning light. They argued cheerfully about names for 3 weeks. Claire wanted something classic and timeless. Thomas, characteristically, wanted something that sounded like it could stand on its own in any room it walked into. They agreed eventually, after 11 days of patient negotiation, on a name they both loved. They told no one. They kept it between them, private and precious, waiting for the person it would belong to. That person began arriving on a Friday evening in late October, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Thomas drove to the hospital with both hands gripping the wheel and something enormous and alive happening in his chest that he could not have described in any language he had professionally mastered. Everything proceeded as the doctors had prepared them. And then, in the space of about 20 minutes, it did not. Claire developed a severe postpartum hemorrhage. The medical team moved with the controlled, rapid professionalism of people who have trained for this and know exactly what needs to happen and understand, even as they work, what the probabilities are. Thomas was asked to wait in the hallway. He stood against a wall in a Charlotte hospital corridor in the clothes he had thrown on when Claire told him it was time, and he stood there while the minutes passed in a way that felt entirely unlike the way time normally passes, thick and slow and wrong. A doctor came. She sat down beside him on one of the hallway chairs. She spoke in the way that doctors speak when there is nothing clinical left to say, gently, clearly, without the softening lies that sometimes feel kind and never actually are. Claire was gone within the hour. The hemorrhage had been catastrophic and irreversible. She was 40 years old. She had been alive 3 hours ago, putting her shoes on in their bedroom in Charlotte, telling Thomas not to speed on the way to the hospital. Their daughter was alive. She was in the neonatal unit, early, small, with monitors on her chest and a warming light above her, but she was alive and breathing and the nurses said she was strong for how premature she was. One nurse, a woman with steady hands and quiet eyes, told Thomas that she had her mother's hands. He stood at the glass of the NICU and looked at his daughter and felt the entire architecture of the life he had imagined, the life with Claire, the house with the plants that had names, the Sunday mornings, the person he had been learning to become, collapse into something he did not have words for. He had built companies from nothing. He had made decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods. He had sat across tables from adversaries twice his age and held his position without flinching. And standing at that glass on that night, he was more completely lost than he had ever been in his life. He named her Sophie. The name Claire had wanted, the classic one, the timeless one. He had the birth certificate filled in. Sophie Marie Whitfield. He held her twice in the NICU, both times with the concentrated, terrified care of someone holding something irreplaceable and knowing it. And then, over the next 10 days, while Sophie grew stronger under the warming light, something happened inside Thomas that he would spend the next 9 years refusing to examine fully. It was not a decision, not in the way that word implies deliberate choice and clear-eyed reasoning. It was more like a collapse. Like a structure that had held under extraordinary pressure for a very long time suddenly failing along every seam at once. He was broken in a way that he did not know how to begin rebuilding, and the person who would have helped him rebuild, who had been the architect of the more open, more honest version of himself, was gone. And his daughter, lying in that incubator, needed exactly the kind of sustained, present, emotionally available parent that Thomas Whitfield had spent 43 years not learning to be and had only just begun to understand was possible, and had understood it with someone who was no longer alive to help him get there. Claire's older sister, Patricia Addison, had come to Charlotte when she heard. Patricia was 44, steady and competent and warm, with a husband named Gerald and a home in Nashville and the quality of someone who shows up when things are hard and does not make a production of showing up. Thomas talked to Patricia in the hospital cafeteria on the 6th day after Sophie's birth. He told her he did not think he could do this. She told him that no one felt ready. He said it was more than that. She looked at him for a long time. He asked her, and this is the moment this story pivots on, the moment that everything else flows from, he asked her if she would take Sophie. Just for a while. Just until he found his footing. Patricia said yes. She said yes because she loved her sister and her sister's child and because she could see that Thomas was telling her something true, that he was not in a state to be a present parent, that he was drowning, and she thought it was temporary, and she thought honesty about limitation was better than silence that masks collapse. She thought it was temporary. Thomas signed the guardianship paperwork on a Tuesday morning 10 days after Sophie was born. He walked to the NICU for the last time. He held Sophie. He looked at her face, Claire's face, already, in the particular slope of her forehead and the shape of her mouth. He said, very quietly, to a baby who would not remember it, "I'm sorry. I'm going to be better. I'm coming back." Then he kissed her forehead and handed her to Patricia and walked out of the hospital into the Charlotte morning and drove back to Atlanta and began the long, exhausting, ultimately futile work of outrunning himself. He sent money to Patricia's account every month without exception. He called every few weeks, brief and slightly formal, asking how Sophie was doing, receiving answers that got briefer as the months passed and the space between his presence and his financial contribution became more obvious and more uncomfortable for both of them. He told himself Sophie was settled, Sophie was fine, Sophie had stability he could not have given her in the state he was in. He told himself these things so consistently and with such practiced conviction that they stopped feeling like rationalizations and started feeling like facts. And all the while, in Nashville, a little girl was growing up without him. Learning to walk without him. Losing her first tooth without him. Starting school without him. Learning how to read, how to count, how to be a person in the world, all of it without him. All of it while he sat at the top of a glass tower in Atlanta and told himself she was fine. What Thomas did not know, because he had stopped asking the specific questions that would have told him, was that Patricia's life had quietly and then less quietly come apart. Gerald lost his job in the automotive supplies sector when a plant closure rippled through 3 counties of Middle Tennessee. Patricia kept her administrative position for another year before budget cuts eliminated it. Gerald, unable to find equivalent work, began drinking in the slow, deliberate way of a person who has decided that what is happening to them is permanent. They argued. They separated. He left. Patricia found herself alone with a 4-year-old girl who was not legally her daughter, in an apartment she could no longer afford, with the particular compounded exhaustion of grief and financial strain and isolation that has no dramatic single moment but accumulates, day by day, into something that looks to the outside world like a choice and is actually a slow-motion disaster. She applied for assistance programs. She worked 2 jobs for a while, then 1, then odd shifts. She sold things she had not planned to sell. She called Thomas once, in that period, and left a voicemail that was careful and slightly vague because she had her own pride and her own complicated feelings about what Thomas had done and what she had agreed to, and the voicemail said only that things were difficult and she needed to speak with him. He called back 2 days later. She did not answer. He left a message. The messages stopped. The money he sent bounced back. The account had been closed during the period of upheaval and she had not had the bandwidth to sort out the new details. He noted the bounce. He told himself he would follow up. He did not follow up. By the time Sophie was 5 years old, she and Patricia were moving between emergency shelters and transitional housing programs in Nashville and Memphis, carrying their lives in a rolling suitcase and 2 bags. Patricia worked every shift she could find, laundry services, food prep, overnight cleaning, and she loved Sophie with the particular fierce, non-negotiable love of a woman who had decided, at some point that could not be exactly located, that this child was hers regardless of what the paperwork said or did not say. She braided Sophie's hair every morning when there was time and made sure Sophie went to school and told Sophie every night, even on the nights when she had worked a double shift and could barely hold her eyes open, that she was loved and that tomorrow was going to be okay. She told Sophie about her mother, that Claire had been a nurse, that she had been the kindest person Patricia had ever known, that she had laughed easily and talked to her plants and said yes before the question was finished. She told Sophie these things because she believed a child deserved to know where they came from. She said almost nothing about Sophie's father. She said only that he had gone through a very hard time and that the world was complicated and that some things were difficult to explain until a person was older. Sophie accepted this with the straightforward practicality of a child who has learned that some questions do not have satisfying answers and that asking them again will not change that. Sophie was, by any measure, a remarkable child. Not in a way that announced itself, she was not the loudest in the room or the most performatively charming. Her remarkableness was quieter and more durable than that. She was perceptive in the way of children who have had to pay close attention to the adults around them because adult behavior has direct and significant consequences for their daily lives. She read rooms. She noticed things. She could tell when Patricia was scared before Patricia's face showed it, and she would quietly position herself closer without making a thing of it, just close, just present. She noticed when the younger children at the shelters were frightened or confused and would sit with them in the matter-of-fact way of someone for whom comfort is not a performance but a simple practical act. She was doing well in school, genuinely well, not just getting by well. Her third-grade teacher, a woman named Ms. Okafor who had been teaching for 18 years in Title I schools and had considerable experience identifying children whose potential was outrunning their circumstances, wrote in a mid-year progress report that Sophie had exceptional language skills, strong mathematical reasoning, and an emotional intelligence that was rare in children twice her age. She wrote that with stability and support, Sophie could do anything she set her mind to. Patricia folded that report and put it in the inside pocket of her bag and carried it everywhere, the way you carry something you are not yet sure what to do with but know is important. On the Wednesday evening in November when this story finds its center, Patricia had an appointment with a caseworker at a transitional housing office on Fifth Avenue in downtown Nashville. Sophie had come with her, as Sophie often did when there was no after-school option, and had been given the particular assignment of waiting outside near the building entrance while Patricia went in for what was supposed to be a 20-minute meeting. Sophie sat on a low concrete barrier with her drawstring bag on her back, too heavy for her frame, as it always was, because it contained her current library book, a change of clothes, and a small notebook she used to draw in, and she watched the street with the unhurried, comprehensive attention that was entirely her own. She noticed the rain picking up. She noticed the coffee shop across the street closing early. She noticed a pigeon that was walking in a precise circle near the crosswalk for reasons that seemed important to it. And she noticed, at 9:41 in the evening, the sound of something hitting the concrete in the parking garage ramp just to her right. Not a dramatic sound. Just a sharp exhale and a thud and then silence. She looked toward the ramp. The overhead light was flickering. She could see, at the bottom of the ramp, a shape on the ground that resolved, as she looked more carefully, into a person. A grown man, lying on his side, not moving. Sophie got up. We need to stay here for a moment. We need to stay right here, with this decision, because this is the heart of this entire story. An 8-year-old girl, living without stable housing, wearing one white sneaker and one gray one because the matching pair had worn through and Patricia had not yet had the money to replace both, with a bag too heavy for her back and a jacket 2 sizes too big because it had come from the shelter donation bin and it was the warmest one available. This child heard someone fall in the dark and got up and walked toward it. She did not look around for an adult who could handle it instead. She did not call out from where she was and wait to see if the person would get up on their own. She picked up her bag, walked to the entrance of the ramp, and went up it. And when she saw the man lying on the wet concrete, leg twisted, hand flat on the ground, not sitting up, just lying there in the rain that was sheeting in from the open side of the ramp, she walked to him, crouched down, and said, in a voice that was entirely calm, "Mister, you need help." Thomas Whitfield looked up. His vision was slightly blurred from the impact. He had hit the back of his head lightly when he went down, nothing serious but enough to make the edges of things soft. He saw a small girl crouching over him in a pink jacket, with her bag still on her back. He told her he was fine. She looked at his leg, twisted at the ankle, the foot turned inward in a way that did not look right, and then she looked at his face and she said, "You're not fine." Then she said, "Can you tell me if anything hurts in your chest? Like really hurts, not just from the fall." He stared at her. He said his chest ached but he thought it was from the impact. She nodded, which was not the response he expected from an 8-year-old conducting what appeared to be a basic triage assessment. She said, "Okay. I'm going to get someone to help. Don't try to move." Then she stood up, looked down the ramp toward the entrance, made a rapid assessment, and ran. Not toward the street in general, toward the diner 1 block east, where the lights were on and she had seen people inside 20 minutes ago when she walked past with Patricia. She ran with the drawstring bag thumping on her back and her mismatched shoes hitting the wet sidewalk, and she went through the door of Ruben's all-night diner and said to the man behind the counter, loudly, clearly, without preamble, "There is a man hurt on the parking garage ramp on 5th. He can't get up. I need someone to come help me get him inside." The man behind the counter, whose name was Marcus and who had worked the night shift at Ruben's for 11 years and had seen most things, looked at this child for 1 second and then said, "Let's go." He came out from behind the counter and followed Sophie back up the street and up the ramp, and the two of them, a 53-year-old diner worker and an 8-year-old girl in mismatched shoes, got Thomas Whitfield to his feet. Marcus took most of the weight. Sophie steadied Thomas's left arm. They walked him, slowly, with Thomas wincing at every step on the ankle, down the ramp and along the sidewalk and through the door of the diner, where Marcus settled him into a booth near the window and went to get ice and a glass of water. Sophie sat down across from Thomas. She put her bag on the seat beside her. She looked at him to make sure he was still upright. He was. She said, "Is the pain in your chest any better now that you're sitting?" He said yes, it was. She nodded again, satisfied with this data point, and settled back slightly in her seat. Thomas looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, the way a person looks at something that has just surprised them so completely that they need a moment to take the full measure of it. He said, "How old are you?" She said, 8. He said, "You're 8 years old." She said, "Yes." He said, "You ran to get help." She looked at him with a patient expression that suggested she did not feel this required extensive commentary, since it was obviously what the situation required. She said, "You couldn't get up by yourself. Someone needed to get someone." Thomas looked at the ice that Marcus had brought and placed on the table, and he looked at this child sitting across from him in her too big jacket with her too heavy bag, and he felt something move through him that he could not immediately name. Something that was not quite emotion and not quite recognition and not quite grief but had elements of all three. He said, "Thank you. What's your name?" She said, "Sophie." The name went through him the way his daughter's name always went through him when he allowed himself to think it, like a hand pressing on a bruise. He managed to keep his face still. He said, "That's a beautiful name." She said, "Thank you. My mom chose it." He said, "She has good taste." Sophie looked at him for a moment and said, "She did. She died when I was born." His face did something he could not control. She watched it happen. She said, in a voice that was matter-of-fact but not cold, "It's okay. I didn't know her. But Patricia tells me about her a lot." He said, "Patricia?" She said, "My aunt. She's across the street." And at that moment, the door of the diner opened, and Patricia Addison walked in. She had come out of the transitional housing office to find Sophie gone from the concrete barrier, the drawstring bag absent, and a brief, slightly rain-damp note pressed under a stone that said in Sophie's careful handwriting, "Man fell in garage. Gone to get help. Back soon." Patricia had gone immediately to the ramp, found it empty, seen the scuff marks and the small dark smear from Thomas's coat on the concrete, and had followed the most logical path to the nearest lit building. She pushed the diner door open with the face of a woman managing the specific terror of a parent who has been separated from a child in a city at night and is simultaneously furious and grateful. She scanned the room. She saw Sophie in a booth near the window, sitting across from a man in a dark overcoat with a bag of ice on his ankle. She walked toward them. The man looked up. Something crossed Patricia Addison's face that stopped her mid-step. She recognized him. Not from personal memory, they had met twice, briefly, in the worst week of either of their lives, and grief had blurred those few days into something impressionistic and barely reliable. She recognized him from years of low-level, helpless attention to a person who had a portion of her family's life in his hands, from business profiles, from a photograph she had once found of him accepting an award in Atlanta, from the particular way that some people live rent-free in your awareness because they are connected to something you cannot put down. She stood 3 feet from the booth and looked at Thomas Whitfield and then at Sophie and then at Thomas Whitfield again, and every single thing she had been carrying for 9 years shifted its weight all at once. Thomas said, "Is she yours?" He asked it easily, the way you ask when a child has mentioned an aunt is coming and the aunt has arrived. Patricia's mouth opened. She looked at Sophie. Sophie looked up at her with her clear, patient eyes. And Patricia said the sentence she had been holding for 9 years without knowing she was holding it, "Thomas. It's Patricia. Patricia Addison. Claire's sister." The name Claire hit him like a physical thing. He went absolutely still. He looked at her. Something in his face began to change in a way that was visible even to Sophie, who watched him carefully from across the table. Patricia sat down next to Sophie. Her hands were not quite steady. She said, "Thomas. This is Sophie." A pause. One breath. "She's yours." The diner kept its noise around them. Someone's coffee cup clinked on a saucer 2 tables over. The rain was audible against the window. Marcus was restocking something behind the counter. And Thomas Whitfield sat in a booth in Nashville, Tennessee, and heard his daughter's name said in the same sentence as the word yours, and looked at the brown eyes across the table from him, Claire's eyes, the particular shape of them, the quality of attention in them that he had loved from the first Thursday evening in April in Charlotte, North Carolina, and felt 9 years of constructed distance come down all at once. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says, "I'm still here." We genuinely want to know who is following this story all the way through. Because what happens next, what Thomas does in the next 72 hours, and what Sophie says to him in a hotel hallway that he will remember for the rest of his life, is the part of this story that we believe will stay with you long after the video ends. Thomas did not speak for what Patricia would later describe as the longest 30 seconds of her life. Sophie watched him. She was very still, the way she was still when she was processing something significant. You could almost see it happening, that particular quality of interior attention she had always had, the careful assembling of available information into something she could work with. Thomas looked at Sophie. He looked at Patricia. He looked at Sophie again. His hands, which had been flat on the table on either side of the bag of ice, curled slowly inward. He said, in a voice that was very quiet and not entirely steady, "How long?" Patricia said, "Since the NICU." He closed his eyes. He opened them. He said, "The money. I sent money every month." The account, Patricia said, closed during the move. There were a lot of moves. He said, "I called." She said, "I know. I wasn't in a place to answer." And then it stopped. He said, "I should have," she said, "Yes. Just that. Yes. Not cruel. Not performed. Just accurate." He absorbed it. He did not argue with it. He said, "Where are you living now?" Patricia told him. A transitional housing program. 1 room. They had been there 4 months, which was better than the shelter in Memphis and better than the motel in Murfreesboro, but was still 1 room with a shared bathroom at the end of the hallway and a curfew and rules about visitors and no kitchen access after 9 p.m. He listened to this. His face was doing the thing again, the thing Sophie had noticed earlier, where his control over it was less than complete. Sophie, who had been watching this entire exchange with the attention of a child who understands that something large is happening even if the full dimensions of it are not yet clear to her, said, "Thomas. Are you going to be okay?" He looked at her. Something about the name, the fact that she had used his first name, that she had used it the way a person uses someone's name when they are actually addressing them and not performing address, broke something in him that had been very close to breaking since Patricia said the word yours. He said, "I don't know yet." Sophie considered this. Then she said, "Okay. That's an honest answer." And she got up from her side of the booth and came around to his side and sat down next to him, and she put her small hand on the table near his. Not on his hand. Near it. Close enough to be felt. The gesture of a child who has learned that you offer proximity without requiring it to be accepted, who has learned, from a life that taught her early, that you make yourself available and you let the other person choose. Thomas looked at that small hand on the table beside his. And he put his hand over hers. And he put his face down on his other arm on the table and he wept. Silently, completely, with the total physical helplessness of someone who has been holding something for 9 years and has run out of the ability to hold it any longer. Sophie did not move her hand. She sat beside this man she had found on a wet ramp 40 minutes ago and kept her hand under his and let him cry, and the only thing she said, after a little while, was, "Patricia cries sometimes too. At night. It's okay to let it out." Marcus refilled their coffee from a respectful distance and asked no questions. When Thomas finally lifted his head, his face was a version of itself that Patricia had not seen and Sophie had not yet seen, stripped of the professional competence, the controlled projection of authority and capability, all of it gone, and underneath it a man who looked very much like someone who had been a long way from himself for a long time and had just, involuntarily, arrived back. He said to Patricia, "Tell me everything. Everything I don't know. Start from the beginning. I need to hear all of it." Patricia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." And she told him. She told him about Gerald. About the job loss, the drinking, the separation. About the first shelter, in a part of Memphis that Sophie was too young to remember but Patricia would never forget. About the second shelter, where a woman in the next room screamed at her children every night and Sophie had started sleeping with her hands over her ears. About the transitional housing in Murfreesboro where the heat only worked on alternate days and Sophie had gotten a respiratory infection that cost them 3 weeks of Patricia's wages in medical expenses. About the current place in Nashville, which was better, genuinely better, Patricia said, and she meant it, because Patricia Addison was not a self-pitying woman and she was not performing devastation for his benefit, she was simply reporting, but was still one room and was still not a home. She told him about Sophie's school, about Ms. Okafor, about the progress report. She took it out of her bag and put it on the table in front of him. He read it. He read it twice. His jaw worked. He said, "She's exceptional." Patricia said, "I know." He said, "She's been living like this while he stopped." Patricia said, "While you had everything." "Yes. That is the situation." He said, "I don't have a defense." She said, "I know that too." He said, "What does she know?" "About me?" Patricia said, "That her father went through a very hard time and is complicated to explain." "I didn't tell her your name. I didn't tell her what you do. I didn't want her to know that there was this amount of money in the world and it was connected to her and it wasn't here." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That was right. That was the right call." Patricia said, "I know." There was a long pause. Then Thomas said, "What does she need? What does she need right now, tonight, and tomorrow, and this week?" Patricia looked at him. Then she looked at Sophie, who had migrated back to her side of the booth and was now drawing in her notebook, giving the adult space with the tact of a child who has spent considerable time around adult conversations and understands when she is not the primary audience. Patricia said, "She needs a bed that belongs to her. She needs a school she doesn't have to leave. She needs to know what next month looks like. She's 8 years old and she has never once been able to assume that next month looks the same as this one." Thomas said, "I can do that. Starting tonight." Patricia said, "Don't say things tonight that you won't do next week." He said, "Patricia. I'm not leaving." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to hear it as the most important single thing you will hear in this conversation. Sophie does not show you when she's hurt. She has learned, because her life required it, not to show need openly. She will not tell you if you disappoint her. She will not come to you and say you broke something. She will go quiet. She will get very polite. And she will recalibrate what she expects from you, downward, and she will never quite recalibrate it back up. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He said, yes. She said, so when you make a promise to her, you will keep it. Not mostly. Not usually. You will keep it every time. He said, I will keep it every time. Sophie, who had been drawing in her notebook, looked up at that moment. She looked at Thomas. Then she looked at her drawing. Then she tore the page carefully out of the notebook and slid it across the table to him without comment and went back to drawing a new one. He picked it up. It was a picture of a parking garage ramp. At the bottom of the ramp was a figure lying on the ground. At the top of the ramp, small but clear, was a figure in a pink jacket walking toward it. Underneath, in Sophie's careful, slightly uneven 8-year-old handwriting, it said, "This is how we met." He held the drawing with both hands. He did not say anything. He put it very carefully in the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest. Sophie watched him do this and then went back to her new drawing without expression, but something in the set of her small shoulders shifted, just slightly, in a way that meant she had noticed and it had mattered. Thomas did not leave Nashville that night. He made 2 calls from the diner bathroom, one to his assistant to clear his entire schedule for the next 4 days, one to the Hotel Indigo 2 blocks away to book 2 rooms. He came back to the table and told Patricia there were rooms for her and Sophie tonight and for the rest of the week if they wanted them, and that there were no conditions attached to this and no performance required from either of them. Patricia started to say something. He said, I know you're not asking me for anything and I know you've been doing this entirely alone and I know that what I'm offering tonight is approximately 9 years late. I'm not asking you to forgive that tonight. I'm asking you to let Sophie sleep in a real bed. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. Sophie, who had been listening while appearing to draw, said, without looking up, does the hotel have a bathtub? Thomas said, yes. She said, with hot water? He said, all the time, as much as you want. She looked up at him then, directly, with a seriousness that had nothing childish about it. She said, okay. And she put her notebook in her bag and stood up and adjusted the straps on her shoulders and said to Patricia, ready? They walked the 2 blocks to the hotel through the rain, the 3 of them, with Thomas limping slightly on the ankle and Sophie walking between the 2 adults with her bag on her back. The hotel lobby was warm and bright. The woman at the desk did not ask any questions, because Thomas had booked 2 rooms and was paying cash and had a bearing that did not invite questions. They rode the elevator to the 4th floor. Thomas and Patricia stood in the hallway while Sophie went into the room. They heard the bathroom door open. Then they heard the sound of water running. Then silence. Then, after a few minutes, the soft sound of a child settling into water that was exactly the right temperature. Patricia stood in the hallway and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Thomas leaned against the wall opposite the door. They did not speak for a while. Then Patricia said, quietly, she asked me once, she was 6, she asked me why we didn't have a bathtub at the shelter. I told her some places had them and some didn't. She said, do you think we'll have one someday? I said yes. She said, okay, and she went to sleep. Thomas closed his eyes. He stayed leaning against the wall for a long time. The following morning he sat with Patricia at the hotel breakfast table while Sophie slept later than she usually allowed herself. Her body, recognizing the bed, had simply held on to sleep past its usual hour, and neither of them disturbed her. Patricia told him the rest of what he needed to know. The specifics of Sophie's school situation: the current school was decent but she had been there only 2 months and had changed schools 3 times in 2 years. The specifics of the medical: Sophie was healthy, no major issues, but she was behind on some standard checkups because the clinic appointments kept conflicting with shelter curfews or Patricia's work schedule. The specifics of the legal: the guardianship paperwork Thomas had signed 9 years ago was temporary and had never been formalized, which meant their situation existed in a kind of administrative gray zone that made certain things harder than they needed to be. Thomas listened to all of it. He had a legal pad that he had asked the front desk for, and he was writing things down in the methodical, sequential way of a man who processes emotional devastation by converting it immediately into a to-do list, not because the emotion is not present but because forward motion is the only thing he knows how to do with it. Patricia watched him write. She said, "You're going to make a list and work through it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Okay. That's fine. Just don't let the list become a substitute for actually being there." He looked up from the pad. He said, "I know the difference." She looked at him for a moment and said, "I believe you. I'm not sure you did 9 years ago. I think you do now." He said, "I didn't. I do now." She said, "Good." Sophie appeared at the breakfast table at 9:15, freshly showered, wearing the clean clothes from her bag, with her hair braided on both sides for once. She had done it herself, which Patricia noted and said nothing about, because Sophie braiding her own hair was a new thing and meant something. She sat down and looked at the breakfast options. The hotel had a buffet, modest but real, with eggs and fruit and toast and small individual yogurt containers, and she looked at it all for a moment with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual. Then she picked up a plate and served herself with the careful, measured restraint of a child who has learned to take only what they are sure they are allowed. Thomas watched her do this. He said, "You can take as much as you want, Sophie. There's plenty." She looked at him. She looked at the buffet. She put 2 more pieces of toast on her plate. Then she sat down and began to eat, and after a moment she said, conversationally, "There was a bird outside the window this morning. A small one, gray, with a red spot on its head. I looked it up in my notebook. I draw birds sometimes, and I think it was a house finch, but the red was more orange, so it might have been something else." Thomas said, "What notebook?" She said, "My nature notebook. I have one for birds and one for regular drawing and one for writing." He said, "You write?" She said, "Stories sometimes. Mostly observations." He said, "What kind of observations?" She considered him for a moment, deciding something. Then she reached into her bag, which was, as always, on the chair beside her, and she took out a small spiral notebook with a blue cover, and she opened it to a page near the middle, and she read, in the clear, slightly formal voice of a child reading their own work, November 3rd. The woman at the shelter front desk has a picture of a child on her phone. She looks at it when she thinks no one is watching. The child in the picture is maybe 4 years old. I think the woman does not live with that child. I think she misses them. I drew her a picture of a bird and left it on the desk, and she put it next to the phone picture. Thomas looked at his daughter across the breakfast table. He said, "Sophie. That is beautiful." She looked at him, assessing whether he was performing the compliment or meant it. She apparently decided he meant it. She said, "Thank you," and put the notebook back in her bag and returned to her toast. He spent the next 3 days in Nashville. He did not go back to Atlanta. On the first day he called his attorney and initiated the formal legal process of establishing paternity and working toward a comprehensive custody and guardianship arrangement that gave Sophie stability and gave Patricia the recognition and support she was owed for 9 years of being this child's actual present parent. He was not trying to remove Sophie from Patricia's life. He made this explicit in every conversation, with his attorney and with Patricia and, eventually, with Sophie herself. Patricia was Sophie's family. That was not a fact to be undone. It was a fact to be supported, properly, for the first time. On the second day he found a 3-bedroom house in a Nashville neighborhood with a good elementary school half a mile away and a yard with 2 large oak trees, and he signed a 2-year lease and arranged for it to be ready for occupancy in 3 weeks. Not a temporary place. Not transitional housing. A house, a real one, with a kitchen and a yard and a bathtub that produced hot water all the time, as much as you wanted. On the 3rd day he sat down at the hotel breakfast table with Sophie and told her the truth. He told it simply. He told it without softening it past recognition, because Sophie was a child who responded to honesty, and he knew this already from 3 days of careful attention. He told her that her mother had been the person he loved most in the world and that losing her had broken something in him. He told her that he had made a decision in the broken state that he had spent a long time telling himself was the right decision and was not. He told her that he had been her father her entire life and had not been present for any of it, and that this was the thing he was most sorry for, out of everything in his life that he was sorry for, and that sorry was not sufficient but it was true. He told her that he was not going anywhere. Sophie listened to all of this without interrupting. Her face was still in the way it got when she was processing something large. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you know my mom was going to name me Sophie?" He said, "Yes. It was her idea. I liked it from the first second she said it." Sophie nodded. She said, "Did you ever say my name out loud? Like, to yourself, when you were thinking about me?" He had to take a breath before he answered. He said, "Yes. Not as often as I should have. But yes." She said, "Okay." Another pause. Then, "Are you going to come to my school things?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Like, if there's a presentation or a thing where parents come?" He said, "I will be there. I will be there early." She looked at him for a long moment. That careful, serious look that was entirely her own. Then she said, "Okay. I believe you." And she picked up her orange juice and went back to looking at the oak tree she could see through the hotel window, and the matter appeared to be, if not resolved, then at least accepted as a beginning. Thomas sat across the table and tried to remember the last time he had been given something as enormous as the 3 words "I believe you," and could not. The house in Nashville was ready on a Thursday in late November, 3 weeks after the night on the ramp. Patricia and Sophie moved in on a cold bright morning with a rented van that Thomas drove himself, because he wanted to do the carrying rather than arrange for other people to do it. Sophie walked through every room of the house when they arrived. She did this methodically, as if conducting an inspection, touching the walls in each room lightly with her fingertips, standing in the center of each space and looking at the ceiling. She saved her room for last. She stood in the doorway of a room that was empty except for an afternoon light coming through the window, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to Patricia and said, "This is going to be my room." Patricia said, "Yes." Sophie said, "No one else's." Patricia said, "No one else's." Sophie nodded. She walked in and sat down in the middle of the empty floor and crossed her legs and stayed there. Thomas and Patricia stood in the doorway and watched her sit in the middle of her room on the bare floor in the afternoon light, not doing anything, just being in it. Patricia put her hand briefly on Thomas's arm. Neither of them said anything. Thomas enrolled Sophie in the new school, a well-funded Nashville elementary school half a mile from the house, with a counseling program and a library that Sophie described, upon her first visit, as serious, the following Monday. He drove her on the first day. She sat in the passenger seat with her drawstring bag on her lap, wearing new shoes, both matching, both the right size, which she had chosen herself from the store with the focused decisiveness of someone who has spent considerable time in shoes that did not fit properly and has opinions about this. He pulled up to the school entrance. Sophie sat still for a moment before getting out. Thomas said, "I'll be here at 3:15. She looked at him. She said, "Promise?" He said, "Promise." She said, "Okay." She got out, adjusted her bag on her shoulders, and walked toward the entrance. At the door she turned around once. He was still there. She raised her hand, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, and went inside. He sat in the car until the bell rang, and then he sat for another few minutes, and then he drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat there until 2:45, when he drove back and parked at the curb. Sophie came out at 3:14. She saw the car. That flash crossed her face, the one that was relief and more than relief, and then it was gone and she was walking toward him with her bag and her composed expression. She got in. She said, "There's a girl in my class named Amara who has the same shoes as me." He said, "Did you tell her?" She said, "Not yet." But I sat next to her at lunch. He said, good. She looked out the window. After a moment she said, I'm going to tell her tomorrow. He said, I think you should. He was at 3:15 every day he was in Nashville. On the days he had to be in Atlanta, and there were several, because he was in the middle of the most demanding restructuring Whitfield Capital had undertaken in 5 years, and his presence was genuinely required, he arranged for Patricia to do pickup and he called Sophie at 4 o'clock without exception. The calls were brief at first, and then gradually longer, and then started to include things Sophie volunteered without being asked, observations from the nature notebook, updates on Amara, a detailed account of a project about the water cycle that she was working on, a complaint about a boy in her class who kept erasing other people's work on the whiteboard, which Sophie considered a profound social violation. Thomas listened to all of it. He asked about the water cycle project. He asked about the whiteboard boy. He asked about Amara. He kept track of things she mentioned and came back to them in subsequent calls, which Sophie noticed, in the quiet way she noticed everything, and which gradually began to shift something in the quality of the calls, from check-ins into actual conversations, from the careful transactional exchanges of two people building cautious trust into something more relaxed and genuine and mutual. 6 weeks after the night on the ramp, Sophie told him, on a Tuesday afternoon phone call, about a dream she had had about her mother. He was at his desk in Atlanta when she told him this. He turned his chair toward the window. She said, I dreamed that she was in the kitchen making tea. She was singing something but I couldn't hear what. I walked into the kitchen and she turned around and she looked exactly like the photograph Patricia has on the shelf. And she said, there you are. That was it. That's all she said. There you are. Thomas sat at his window in Atlanta for a moment. Then he said, Sophie, I think that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I thought so too. I wrote it down. He said, good. Keep it. She said, I will. 3 months after that first night, Thomas came to Nashville for a Saturday. He and Sophie and Patricia had dinner at a restaurant that Sophie had chosen. She had very specific opinions about restaurants by this point, based primarily on whether they had real tablecloths and whether the bread came before the food, both of which she considered indicators of an establishment worth taking seriously. After dinner they walked along the Cumberland River. It was a cold, clear evening, the kind where the city lights reflect off the water in long ribbons. At some point, without announcement, Sophie reached up and took Thomas's hand. He kept walking. He did not comment on it or make anything of it, because he had learned, in 3 months of careful attention, that drawing attention to Sophie's moments of trust was the quickest way to make her reconsider them. He just held her hand and kept walking. After a while she said, the river is wide here. He said, it is. She said, Patricia told me that rivers look different depending on where you're standing. He said, that's true. She said, I think people are like that too. Like, you look different to me than you probably look to the people at your work. He thought about this. He said, how do I look to you? She thought for a moment. Then she said, like someone who is trying really hard to get something right that they got wrong for a long time. He walked beside the river with his daughter's hand in his and said, that is exactly what I am. She said, I know. I can tell. And she looked out at the water, and Thomas looked at the side of her face, the slope of her forehead that was Claire's, the particular set of her mouth that he was beginning to understand was entirely Sophie's own, and he thought about what it means to be known by a person, and what it costs to earn it, and what it is worth when you have. 11 months after the night on the parking garage ramp, Thomas Whitfield held a press conference in Nashville in which he announced the creation of the Claire Whitfield Foundation. He had spent those 11 months doing 2 things simultaneously, being a father, with increasing competence and increasing reward, and building something that he believed was the only honest response to what he had learned. He had learned it slowly and then all at once, the way most important things are learned, that the story of a homeless 8-year-old girl who was actually a billionaire's daughter was not, in the world he had come from, unusual in the way it should be. It was, in fact, representative of something larger and more structural and more inexcusable. He had spent those 11 months talking to caseworkers, shelter directors, school counselors, housing advocates, children's rights attorneys, and pediatric healthcare workers. He had visited transitional housing facilities in 5 cities. He had sat in rooms where people described, with the patient accuracy of professionals who have been describing this for years to people who rarely do anything about it, what it means to grow up without stable housing, what it costs a child's developing brain, their sense of safety, their relationship to the future, their ability to form the kind of trust that sustains a life. He had listened to all of it with the particular intensity of a man who is not listening to data but to the description of his own daughter's first 8 years. And he had come away from those conversations with a specific, structured plan. The Claire Whitfield Foundation has 2 main programs. The first is the Stable Home Initiative, which provides emergency housing stabilization for families with children under 10 who are at immediate risk of losing housing or are currently in shelter situations. Not just emergency funds, actual housing, secured and sustained for a minimum of 18 months, with wraparound support services including school enrollment assistance, healthcare access, and regular family check-ins. The goal is not to pause homelessness. The goal is to end it, for each family the program serves, in a way that gives the children in those families the one thing Sophie had been denied until she was 8 years old, the ability to assume that tomorrow looks like today. The second program is the Present Parent Initiative, which funds individual therapeutic and practical support for parents who have left children in others' care, voluntarily or otherwise, and want to return to active parenting but face the particular combination of shame, practical obstacles, and systemic invisibility that makes that return harder than it needs to be. Thomas had not designed this program for himself. He had designed it after meeting, in the course of his research, 14 other parents in situations structurally similar to his, not bad people, not cruel people, broken people who had made the easier choice in the worst moment of their lives and had then been held in place by the accumulating weight of time and guilt and the sense that it was too late. He did not believe it was ever too late. He believed it was almost always harder than it should be, and that the difficulty was not intrinsic but structural, and that structure could be changed. The foundation's launch event was held not in a hotel ballroom but in the gymnasium of a Nashville elementary school in a low-income neighborhood on the south side of the city, a school that had been identified as one of the primary feeders for the shelter systems the foundation intended to serve. Sophie sat in the front row between Patricia and Amara, who had been invited because Sophie said she wanted her there, and Thomas had learned, in 11 months, that when Sophie said she wanted something it was worth listening carefully to. Thomas stood at a podium that was actually a music stand borrowed from the school's band room, because the gymnasium did not have a lectern, and he told the story. He told the whole story. He did not use the compressed, carefully edited version that his communications team had drafted. He used the real version, the NICU, the guardianship papers, the bounce back from the closed account, the 9 years of preferred distance dressed up as practical decision-making. He told it in the specific, accurate, unsparing way that Patricia had told it to him in the diner, and he told it for the same reason she had told it to him, because the record needed to be accurate and because accuracy, in this case, was the only thing that made the foundation meaningful. He said, "I had $3.7 billion and my daughter was growing up in a shelter. I want everyone in this room to sit with that for a moment. Not to judge me, though you are welcome to, the judgment is warranted, but to understand that this is not a story about a monster. It is a story about a broken person who made a choice and then made the same choice every day for 9 years by simply not making a different one. And then an 8-year-old girl in mismatched shoes climbed a wet ramp in the dark and refused to walk past me. And I want to do for other children what Sophie did for me. I want to make it so that their stories do not require a billionaire to fall on a parking garage ramp in the right city at the right time to have a decent ending. I want to change the conditions, not wait for the coincidence." He looked at Sophie in the front row when he said this. She was watching him with those steady, serious eyes. She nodded once, the way she did when she had considered something carefully and decided it was right. The room was entirely quiet for a moment before it was not quiet at all. After the event, in the parking lot of the school, while Patricia talked to the foundation's executive director and Amara showed Sophie something on her phone, Thomas stood by himself for a few minutes and looked up at the November sky. He thought about Claire. He thought about her in the specific way he had learned, over the past 11 months, to think about her, not with the blunt, total avoidance that had been his method for 9 years, not yet with full peace, but with the particular kind of honest grief that had room in it for gratitude alongside the loss. He was grateful she had laughed before he finished the question. He was grateful for the plants with names. He was grateful that Sophie had her eyes and, apparently, her habit of saying yes before the whole thing was said. He was grateful, in a way he would not have been capable of a year ago, for the night on the ramp, for the rain, for the slick concrete, for the flickering light, for the 4% battery on the cracked phone, for every particular condition that had placed him on that ground at that moment. And he was, above everything else he felt on that cold November evening in a parking lot in Nashville, Tennessee, profoundly and permanently grateful that an 8-year-old girl had looked at a man on the ground and had not, for even a single second, considered walking past. Sophie turned 9 in March, 4 months after the foundation launch. She had been in the same school for 5 months by then, the longest she had ever attended a single school, and she had not moved once and she had not had to pack her bag in the middle of the night and she had not had to explain to a new teacher why she was starting mid-year and she had not had to sleep with her hands over her ears because someone was screaming in the next room. She had a room. She had a bathtub. She had hot water whenever she wanted it. She had Amara, who had turned out to be exactly the kind of friend who argues with you about things that do not matter and stands next to you without hesitation for things that do. She had Patricia, who was the same Patricia she had always been, steady, present, fierce, braiding her hair in the mornings and reading with her at night and telling her about Claire. And she had Thomas, who was at 3:15 every day he was in Nashville and who called at 4 o'clock on the days he was not, and who remembered every single thing she told him and came back to it the next time, and who had shown up at her class's winter performance in December, a somewhat chaotic arrangement of holiday songs performed by 8- and 9-year-olds with varying degrees of musical commitment, 40 minutes early and stayed 20 minutes after to meet Ms. Okafor, who shook his hand and said, "Sophie talks about you." He had not been able to say anything to that. He had simply nodded. For her birthday, Sophie requested 2 things. The first was a bookshelf for her room, a real one, floor to ceiling, because the books had been accumulating on the floor and in her bag and on the windowsill and she was running out of surfaces. Thomas built it himself, over a Saturday, from a kit, with Sophie supervising and occasionally suggesting that he was putting something in upside down, which twice turned out to be correct. The second thing she requested was a trip to the river. Not a restaurant, not a party with a lot of people she did not know very well. Just the river, the 3 of them, her, Patricia, Thomas, and sandwiches, and the afternoon. They went on a Sunday in early March when the weather was cold but clear. They sat on a bench near the water and ate the sandwiches Patricia had made. Sophie had her nature notebook and spent a portion of the afternoon cataloging birds. She pointed out a great blue heron standing absolutely still in the shallows approximately 30 feet from where they were sitting and said, "That's the same kind I saw last fall. They stand like that for a long time and then they just, suddenly, get the fish. You never see the moment they decide to move." Thomas watched the heron. He said, "I think some decisions look like stillness from the outside." Sophie looked at him. She said, "That's good. Can I write that down?" He said, "It's yours." She wrote it in her notebook. She drew a small heron next to it. Then she put the notebook away and leaned back on the bench and looked at the sky and said, in the comfortable, unhurried voice of someone speaking a thought they have been holding for a while and have finally decided to release, "I'm glad I went up that ramp." Patricia made a small sound. Thomas looked at his daughter's profile against the March sky. He said, "So am I, Sophie. More than I can say." She said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. The heron was still in the water, motionless. Then she said, "I think Mom would think it was a good story." He said, "I think so too. I think she'd think you were the best part of it." Sophie looked at the river. She said, obviously. And she said it in a way that made Thomas laugh, a real laugh, unexpected and full, and Patricia laughed too, and Sophie smiled the particular small smile of a person who has made the people they love laugh and knows it and is satisfied. The heron did not move. The river kept going. The afternoon light was on the water and on the bench and on the face of an 8-year-old girl who had walked up a wet ramp in the dark toward a stranger and had not known, and could not have known, that she was walking towards something that had always been hers. We want to take a few minutes now before we close this story, because we think it deserves more than a summary. We think it deserves the question it is actually asking, stated plainly, because it has been asking it the entire time. The question is this: what are we walking past? Not in a dramatic, general sense. Specifically. What specific person, what specific child, what specific relationship that matters to you, are you walking past right now, today, because stopping would require you to face something difficult? Because this story is not, at its core, about a billionaire and a homeless girl and a dramatic revelation in a diner. Those are the circumstances. The story is about a choice. Actually, it is about a series of the same choice, made the same way, every day for 9 years. The choice to keep a comfortable distance. The choice not to call back. The choice to send money and tell yourself that money is presence. The choice to let temporary become permanent because permanent is harder and temporary, for now, is survivable. Thomas Whitfield is not a rare person. He is a very ordinary person placed in an extraordinary circumstance who responded in the way that ordinary people respond when grief and fear and the relative ease of distance are all pointing in the same direction, by doing the easier thing, and then doing it again, and then doing it so many times that it stopped feeling like a choice. What is rare about Thomas Whitfield's story is not what he did. What is rare is what happened to him on a parking garage ramp. Most people do not get a Sophie on a ramp. Most people do not get the dramatic providential collision that forces a reckoning. Most people get the quiet continuation of the distance, and the child grows up, and the years pass, and the moment when something could have been different is not identifiable as a moment but only in retrospect as a period, a long gray period of ordinary days in which nothing dramatic happened and everything important was lost. We are asking you to think about whether there is something in your life that you are handling the way Thomas handled his distance. Not necessarily a child. Not necessarily someone you have left behind. Maybe it is a person you have been too proud to call. Maybe it is a relationship that is technically intact but functionally hollow because genuine presence would require something you are not yet willing to give. Maybe it is a version of yourself, a more open version, a less defended version, the version that would walk up the ramp instead of deciding that the person on the ground is probably fine, that you have been keeping at a safe distance because the distance is easier than the alternative. We are not asking you to fix everything tonight. We are asking you to think about it. The way Sophie thought about the man on the ground. The way she did not decide, in a second, whether helping would be complicated or whether she was equipped for it or whether it might cost her something. She just saw someone who needed help and she went. Think about who that person is in your life. The one you have been maintaining a careful, comfortable, self-protective distance from. Think about what it would mean to walk up the ramp. And then think about what 9 years of walking past looks like from the inside, which is Thomas Whitfield standing in a hotel hallway listening to the sound of his daughter running a bath and not being able to move. 1 year after the night on the ramp, Thomas Whitfield sat down to write a letter. He wrote it by hand, which he had not done since grade school, because it seemed to require that. He wrote it to Sophie, not as the document of a legal proceeding or the statement of a foundation or the announcement of a decision, but as a letter from a father to a daughter, on the 1-year anniversary of the night she climbed a ramp in the rain toward a stranger and changed both their lives. He wrote it on a Sunday afternoon in Nashville, sitting at the kitchen table of the house on the quiet street, while Sophie was in the backyard doing something involved with a jar and what appeared to be a caterpillar. He wrote about the night they met. He wrote about the way she had looked at him when she said, "You're not fine," the complete, unsentimental accuracy of it, the refusal to accept a comfortable untruth. He wrote about the diner, and the drawing of the ramp, and the small hand on the table near his. He wrote about the hotel hallway. He wrote about watching her choose her shoes in the store with those specific, considered opinions about what shoes should feel like. He wrote about the heron on the river and what she had said about decisions looking like stillness. He wrote about 3:15 every day, which was now less a promise than a fact, the kind of fact that does not require articulation because it has simply become part of the structure of things. He wrote, "You did not know who I was when you walked up that ramp. You did not know that I was your father. You did not know that the man on the ground had been your father for 8 years without deserving to be called that. You helped me because I was a person who needed help and you were the person who was there. I have spent 12 months trying to understand what kind of person does that, at 8 years old, after the life you had lived, and I have come to the conclusion that it is not something that can be fully explained. It is something you were born with and something Patricia kept alive in you through 8 years of extraordinary love and effort, and something your mother, who you never met but whose hands you have and whose eyes you have and whose way of saying yes before the question is finished you also have, placed in you before she knew who you would become. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you gave me on that ramp. Not the rescue, though I was very glad to be rescued, but the trust. The willingness to see a person on the ground and decide that they were worth walking toward. I am going to try, every day, to be that for you." He sealed the letter and put it in a small box he had bought for the purpose. He gave it to Sophie at dinner that evening. She read it at the table while Patricia cleared the dishes. She read it all the way through. When she was done she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and looked at Thomas across the table. She said, "This is really good." He said, "I meant every word." She said, "I know. That's why it's good." She put the envelope in her nature notebook, the new one, the third one, the one she had started in December because the second one was full. She put it right at the front, before the birds. Then she closed the notebook and put it in her bag, which was, for the first time in the year since Thomas had known her, not too heavy for her frame. He had noticed this a few months ago. He had not said anything, because Sophie did not always want things commented on. But he had noticed. The bag was lighter now. She was carrying less. The Claire Whitfield Foundation served 247 families in its first year of operation. Of those, 193 achieved stable long-term housing by the end of the year. The Stable Home Initiative expanded to 3 cities beyond Nashville, Memphis, Atlanta, and Charlotte, which Thomas had chosen specifically because it was the city where Claire had lived and where Sophie had been born. The Present Parent Initiative, which had been the more uncertain of the 2 programs when the foundation launched, turned out to be the one that generated the most applications, more than the team had projected, by a significant margin, which Thomas understood when he thought about it not as a statistical outcome but as a fact about human beings. That there were that many people out there carrying the same thing he had carried, and had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to make it slightly less impossible to set down. He read some of the applications himself. He should not have, probably, it was not his role and it was not scalable, but he needed to, at least once, to understand what he had built. He read about a father in Memphis who had left his son with a grandmother at 2 years old during a crisis and had not been back in 6 years. He read about a mother in Atlanta who had surrendered temporary custody during a period of severe mental illness and had been told, implicitly and repeatedly by the systems she encountered, that wanting to come back was presumptuous. He read about a man in Charlotte, whose story was so close to his own in its contours that he had to put the application down and look out the window for a few minutes before he could continue. He approved all of them. He approved all of them personally, which was something the Foundation's board noted gently might not be a sustainable practice, and Thomas said he understood, and he kept doing it. Patricia Addison is still Sophie's primary daily parent. She lives in the house on the quiet street with Sophie, and she has a job she likes, a managerial position at a non-profit housing organization, which Thomas did not arrange for her and which she was qualified for on the basis of 8 years of lived expertise that the hiring committee recognized as exactly the kind of knowledge their organization needed. She and Thomas have arrived, gradually and without ceremony, at something that functions as a genuine co-parenting relationship, not without tension, not without the occasional conversation that requires both of them to say things they would rather not say, but honest and mutual and oriented entirely around Sophie, which is the only orientation Patricia has ever been willing to accept. Thomas is in Nashville most weekends. He has reduced his direct involvement in Whitfield Capital's day-to-day operations and brought in an exceptionally capable CEO to run it, which is a decision several board members told him was premature and which he describes as the clearest professional decision he has made in his career, because it was the first one he made with the foundation's goals as the primary consideration and everything else second. Sophie is, as of the writing of this story, 9 years old. She has been in the same school for 1 full year. She has a bookshelf that is floor to ceiling and is currently full. She has a nature notebook that is almost full and will require a 4th one soon. She has Amara, who comes over on Saturday mornings and argues with her about pastries. She has a yard with 2 oak trees, one of which she has determined is better for climbing than the other and has provided a written assessment of the relevant factors to Patricia, who reviewed it and approved tree climbing with conditions that Sophie considers reasonable. She has a bathtub with hot water all the time. She has a father who is at 3:15 every day he is in the city, and who calls at 4 o'clock every day he is not, and who remembers every bird she has told him about and every observation she has written down and every single thing she has said to him since the night she walked up a wet ramp and crouched beside a man on the ground and said, with the clear uncomplicated confidence of a child who has decided what is right and done it, "Mister, you need help." She was right. He did. And now, before you close this video, we need to ask you something. Not about the story, about you. We have been telling you about a man who spent 9 years maintaining a careful distance from a person he loved and a life he owed, and about the 8-year-old girl who ended that distance without knowing she was doing it. But we want to know about your distance. The one you have been maintaining. The person you have not called. The relationship you have let go quiet. The child, or the parent, or the friend, or the version of yourself that you have been keeping at arm's length because arm's length is survivable and the alternative is hard. We want you to leave a comment right now. Not a generic comment. A real one. Tell us, is there someone in your life this story made you think of? Tell us who they are, you do not need to use their name. Tell us what your distance looks like, and whether you are going to do something about it. We will read every single one. We read every one, always, because the people who watch all the way to the end of stories like this one are the people who are actually thinking about what they mean. And if this story moved something in you, if you felt something shift while you were watching, then do not let it stay a feeling you had watching a video. Let it be the thing you carry into tomorrow. Let it be the thing that makes you pick up the phone. Drive to the house. Walk up the ramp. Because Sophie did not know who Thomas Whitfield was when she went up that ramp. She did not know that it would change her life as much as it changed his. She just knew that someone was on the ground and that she was there and that those two facts together meant she had to go. That is the whole lesson. That is everything. Go. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next story we are bringing you is just as real and just as human and just as impossible to look away from. And until then, whatever ramp is in front of you tonight, do not walk past it. Go.